Welcome to Life Happens, where Texans come to protect their legacy and prepare for the second half of life. Join your host, attorney Kim Hegwood of Your Legacy Legal Care, and our weekly guest as we navigate the challenges that emerge as life happens. Now here's your host, Kim Hegwood.
Good morning and welcome to Life Happens with me, Kim Hegwood, and our very special guest today is Katie Duncan. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm really excited about having you, but I just want to kind of put it out there for those listeners that are listening right now that are fixing to do that. This is going to be a little hard to go through today. And so because we're going to talk about understanding the dying process, and this might trigger some people if they've had to go through this, so it's one of those things where you need to know, but sometimes you don't want to know. And so we're going to talk about that. And so you wrote the book, The Dying Process. And can you tell our listeners why you did it, what your background is, what inspired you to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. A little background about me. I am an adult gerontology primary care nurse practitioner. I work primarily in nursing homes with adults and older adults, many of whom are at the end of their lives. Before that, I was a ICU nurse, and I also worked several years as a home hospice nurse, so with people who are dying and at the end of their life and their families in wherever they called home. I, a few years ago, started my own business as actually an end-of-life coach. So when I first started, I was taking on clients one-on-one, anyone who had a serious or terminal diagnosis, and I would also work with them and their families. I actually have just recently sort of transitioned. I have been taking less one-on-one clients recently, and I've been really trying to educate. I really just want to try to close more gaps and fill the gaps that are missing in healthcare. So I am now actually training. I run a program that trains people who are interested in becoming an end-of-life coach or an end-of-life doula or death doula. And we're actually finding that a lot of our people in our program are just people who want to learn and prepare themselves or their families, and healthcare professionals as well, nurses, nurse practitioners, social workers, things like that, to serve their clients better. So that's my background. And why did I write this book? I wrote this book. I will never forget my granddad. I got the call on my 30th birthday that my granddad was in the hospital, and it took us all by surprise, pretty healthy 90-year-old. But it turns out he ended up with this really serious infection, and long story short, he really just wasn't able to fully recover and rebound. And it ended up that our family had to be the ones to ask the healthcare providers that we bring him home on hospice. And he ended up dying a week and a half later. And I wrote this book because I remember in this time thinking, one, not only that we just had no conversation about death, dying, end of life, hospice, but I realized, there are so many gaps. I always knew there were gaps in healthcare, just throughout every system, everywhere as a healthcare provider. But this time I was on the family side, so I was actually feeling that gap. And I was watching my family who had no idea what to expect and what was normal and what to do, and my grandmother who's so overwhelmed. And I just thought there are not enough resources. People aren't prepared. Families aren't prepared. So I wanted to do something. So after he died, it kind of called me to sit down and write this book. So that's how it came to be.
And so let's talk a little bit about that. So let's talk about what you call the end of life rally.
Great question. So when a person is nearing the end of their lives, they usually appear, when they're sort of transitioning, they appear to be in this deep sleep state. They may appear to be unconscious. They're really not awake or alert or lucid anymore. And they're not eating, they're not drinking. And so families really look at their person and they think, oh, they're probably going to die soon. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they have this rally, the end of life rally. It is this burst or surge in energy where the person suddenly wakes up and they're awake, they're alert, they're lucid, they are talking to people, their family, their friends. They might ask for something to eat or drink. And it's this sudden surge or burst in energy. That is the end of life rally. Sometimes it lasts for just several minutes. Sometimes it can last for hours. Sometimes it can last a day or several days. And almost just as quickly as they have this burst in energy, they suddenly will go back into this deep sleep, unconscious like state. And usually they die very quickly after that, sometimes the same night, same day, the next day, or several days later.
So you hear different things, and when it comes to, how you take care of somebody, or how to make them comfortable. Does morphine speed up the death at the end of life?
That is such a good question. I'm so glad you asked that. Such a controversial question too. And there are really a lot of points to cover, because I think it is so misunderstood, not just in society, but even among healthcare providers who aren't in end-of-life care and it's not their specialty. It's a huge misconception there too. So I'm going to kind of go through a few really important points here. Number one, actually, let me start with this short answer. No, if morphine is used in a controlled environment, as it is in hospice, and it's used as prescribed, morphine does not speed up death. It doesn't speed up the dying process. There are two really significant symptoms that a dying person may experience throughout their end-of-life journey. Number one is pain. And number two is breathing distress. Someone might be short of breath or breathless, like they can't catch their breath. And oftentimes at the very end of life, in the actively dying phase, someone might be breathing very heavy and labored. And so morphine is used for both of these symptoms, both pain and any sort of breathing discomfort, let's call it. The World Health Organization actually endorses morphine as the gold standard for treating moderate to severe pain at the end of life. And the reason is because morphine has what we call a very short half-life. What that means is morphine basically comes into the body really quickly, and then it leaves the body really quickly. So it's in and it's out. And so for that reason, it is actually very easy to adjust the dose of morphine quickly and safely because of that short half-life, in order to keep that person comfortable and meet their needs and treat their pain or their shortness of breath. So that's why it's really considered the gold standard for treating these two symptoms specifically. For shortness of breath, morphine works in a few different ways. We don't totally understand exactly how it works, but we do understand some. Morphine works directly to slow the rate of someone's breathing. So it slows their breathing rate. For someone who is short of breath, they're breathing fast and they're anxious, that's a good thing. That's a positive effect of the medication. The second part is that morphine actually decreases their perception, so how they feel. It decreases their perception of their shortness of breath. So another positive effect. And it's actually used not just for people at the end of life with shortness of breath, but people with chronic lung disease, COPD, pulmonary fibrosis, emphysema, things like that. So I think there's a few more points here that are probably important just to kind of wrap up what I just said. So a couple of side effects of morphine. One, that it can cause a person who's never received a medication that has a drowsiness side effect. Morphine can cause drowsiness with the first few doses. So it can make someone sleepy and go to sleep. But that drowsiness wears off very quickly within the first few doses, within the first few days. The second thing, again, is that it slows that person's breathing. That's a side effect. But again, just like that drowsiness, within the first few doses of morphine, that slowed breathing also wears off. And the doses that are used in hospice are actually lower than even the recommended dose for someone who's never received an opioid like morphine before. So it is not enough medication to just stop someone from breathing altogether. It's a very low dose. The last big point here that I think can kind of wrap this up is, I think one of the biggest reasons people have this misconception that morphine speeds up death is that, unfortunately, way too often people are coming on to hospice way too late in their disease process. They are already very, very close to actively dying. And so by the time they receive their first dose of morphine to try to get their symptoms under control, they go to sleep and they don't wake up and they die very quickly after that. And that's because they were already dying. It's not because the morphine made them die. And so like I said, in an environment like hospice, the doses are low, they are very safe. And when they're used in that controlled environment and used as prescribed, it does not speed up death.
My grandmother, when she passed, was probably out of it like a week before, to where she was just asleep. So you'd sit beside her, talk to her, so you always have, people ask us, can they hear you? When they're unconscious.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. Yes. We have always believed, researchers and anyone in end-of-life care has always believed that the dying person can still hear us, but we didn't really have a lot of evidence to back that up. There was actually a recent study that was done out of the University of British Columbia that basically gave us that evidence, that basically they measured the electrical waves, the brain activity, and it showed that people who are dying even in their last hours can likely still hear us because of the brain activity that is looking exactly the same as the brain activity in a young, healthy person when people are hearing. So it was kind of that evidence to say, yes, we've always believed this because of the experiences we've had, but now we actually have, it's one study and it's one small study, but it is, some evidence to back that up.
Well, I've always believed they could hear you, so we'd sit and talk, take turns talking to her, different things, so I think that's, and that was just, my personal, opinion, kind of thing. And so let's talk about something that's a little more harder for clients. A lot of times, when someone, is dying, they're moaning like they're in pain and things like that. So what does that mean for someone?
It's a great question. I would actually say in my personal experience, I have less people who have or experience or have that moaning, groaning, humming type of noise. I always do, but it's less frequent, I would say. Here's the thing that I think is important to share is that no matter what the situation, we always are going to hear different things from a dying person, but no matter what the situation, we always have to look at the whole picture, no matter what. So there are two different examples that I'm thinking about here. One example is that I might have a client who is making a moaning or groaning sound or humming sound. And when you look at the whole picture, when you look at them, they're scrunching their face, they're clenching their jaw, they're grimacing, their body's really clenched and rigid. And they seem overall, their whole nonverbal body language is telling us something's not right. They are in some sort of emotional or physical distress. And we don't always know, but whether it's emotional or physical or both, but we're looking at the whole picture, and hospice is likely going to try to treat them for either physical pain or emotional distress, anxiety, agitation, or both. So that's one situation. That might be why someone is making a moaning or groaning sound. Now, I've also had many experiences. I had this one woman in particular. She was making this moaning, groaning, humming sound, but when you looked at her, she looked like she was in this deep sleep state. Her face was relaxed. Her body was calm and relaxed. She really looked very peaceful. And we know that moaning and humming and groaning, those are actually natural self-soothing practices. They actually activate the parasympathetic, that vibration activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest. It's the calming part of our nervous system. And so many people actually do this just as a natural, comforting, soothing thing. And so for this woman, she really didn't look like she was in any sort of physical or emotional distress. And so we just allowed her to be as she was, and she died very peacefully. So it's really all about looking at the full picture. whenever you're hearing any sort of moaning or groaning type of sound, and then going based off of their nonverbal body language.
So now that we've talked about that, what about, since we're talking about noises,
Yeah.
what about the death rattle, the noise that someone sometimes makes that sounds like that? What is that?
Yeah, good question, and definitely one that a lot of families are always very concerned about. So good to talk about it. So the death rattle, you might hear hospice also call this terminal secretions. I should start out by saying this is a very normal and natural part of the dying process. I mean, that's first things first. This is normal. And so that's always good for families to know. What happens when someone is dying is that eventually they're going to lose the ability to swallow. And then when they are actively dying in the hours to days before death, they're also usually in an unconscious state. And the body during this time is still going to make what we call secretions. Basically, think wet stuff in our body. So saliva in our mouth, mucus in our nose, things like that. We have secretions all throughout our body. And so when the person loses the ability to swallow, they're unconscious, those secretions like saliva end up collecting deep in the back of the throat. And every time that person takes a breath, that air is just passing over that collection of saliva and secretions, and it creates this wet sound. It sounds like a gurgling or rattling type of sound, which I know a lot of families are like, oh my goodness, are they in pain? Are they in distress? Again, we're looking at the full picture. Most of the time, the person appears very calm. I mean, large majority of the time, the person looks calm and relaxed, and they seem totally unbothered, which is why researchers believe really this is not bothersome or painful to a dying person. And this is also not drowning. That's the other big concern that I often hear. Yeah. Drowning would be fluid in the lungs. This is just basically think of it as saliva in the back of the throat, and their breath is passing over it.
Okay, that sounds better. And I think the problem you have is that when the bodies are doing this and the families are already in a state of anxiety and having to, starting that grieving process, that things out of the ordinary tend to terrify people more, so if they just had good information of, yes, this is fine, they're okay, I think it's more of a calming effect, that is good for families to just, I think knowledge is power. So having that knowledge, helps caregivers, and the family know that, yeah, it's all normal stuff. There's nothing, bad happening. It's just part of the process, and that aspect of it. And so you have the book, The Dying Process, and it's my understanding you have that in Spanish as well.
I do. Yes, it's also available in Spanish. Both are available on Amazon.
Nicely done. But what's the Dear Caregiver about?
Oh, Dear Caregiver, It's Your Life Too. This is a little book. It's like one of those daily reads of little self-care tips and tricks. You can take it as fast or as slow as you want, but it's meant as like, a one-a-day little self-caregiving kind of tip.
Perfect. And so this has been great information, for our listeners. So Katie, tell our listeners how they find you if they want more information.
Absolutely. Yes. The easiest way is to just go to my website, deathcarecoach.com. You can contact me and our support team there. You could also contact us through our website, our email, support@deathcarecoach.com.
Perfect. Well, this has been really good information, and I thank you so much for being on the show today, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you so much, Kim. Good to see you.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Life Happens with Kim Hegwood. Be sure to tune in every Thursday at 10 a.m. wherever you listen to your podcast as we navigate through the challenges that emerge as life happens. The content of this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship or constitute attorney-client privilege, legal, medical, financial, or any other professional advice.